All right, it is a beautiful autumn day here in Indianapolis. I'm here with my dad, Don, and we're going to be exploring Crown Hill Cemetery just north of the city. Now, Crown Hill was originally dedicated and established in 1864, and a lot of the people that were originally buried here either died during the American Civil War, whether they were soldiers or they were family members or those that just died after the war. But today it is one of the largest cemeteries in the country with over 25 miles of paved road, 555 acres, I believe, and over 200,000 graves and growing. It is an active cemetery to this day. There are, of course, some older sections and some newer sections. But today we're going to be going around to look at some of the people of our history that are buried here, and it should be a lot of fun. Again, it's absolutely beautiful out. Very nice weather. Okay, thought we would start our visit here at Crown Hill visiting one of the most unique graves that's here at the cemetery. And this is the final resting place of John Dillinger Jr., public enemy number one. And you may be wondering why he is laid to rest here in Indianapolis. And if you don't already know, he actually has a lot of connections here with the city and the state of Indiana. He was born here on June 22nd, 1903, and had a lot of familial connections here in the state, and some of his early crimes actually took place here in Indiana. Some things you may not have known about John Dillinger, though. In 1923, he enlisted in the United States Navy and was assigned to the battleship USS Utah. But after only a few months on board, he deserted the ship when it was moored in Boston, Massachusetts, and made his way back here to Indiana. As early as the 1920s, when he was in his 20s, John Dillinger began to get into a life of crime. John Dillinger's demise finally came in Chicago in July of 1934. While he and his gang hid out in Chicago, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI established a task force, which was headquartered in Chicago, to find Dillinger. On July 21st, 1934, a brothel worker named Anna Sage, who was acquainted with Dillinger, called the FBI. She was a Romanian immigrant and was about to be deported, so she decided to turn in Dillinger with the hope of being able to stay in the United States. She told the FBI that she, Dillinger, and Polly Hamilton, who was another prostitute, were going to see a movie the next day. This would either be at the Marlboro Theater or the Biograph Theater, so the FBI staked out both locations. And just as planned, Dillinger, Sage, and Hamilton attended the Biograph Theater on the night of July 22nd to see, ironically, the gangster film Manhattan Melodrama, which featured Clark Gable. And after the movie ended, the three left the theater, walked right into the snares of the FBI. Agent Purvis stood near the theater doors, and once he saw the three, he lit his cigar as a signal to the other agents. And Dillinger actually looked directly into the agent's face, and he knew that the gig was up. He ended up proceeding to a nearby alleyway, and some accounts state that he pulled out a gun, but regardless, three agents fired at him, and Dillinger was hit 4 times, with the fatal shot entering the back of his neck, severing his spinal cord, and exiting under his right eye. And he was dead. So his body was actually put on public display in Cook County there in Chicago. And of course, he was really a celebrity at the time, that over 15,000 people supposedly came to view his body. Anyway, from Chicago, his body was brought back here to his hometown of Indianapolis, and he's buried right here at Crown Hill Cemetery. One other quick thing here at the John Dillinger gravesite. He is buried right next to his parents, Molly Dillinger, 1870 to 1907, and his father, John Dillinger, born during the American Civil War in 1864 and died during World War II in 1943. And now we're here at the Confederate Mound, which is the final resting place of well over 1,000 Confederate POWs that died here in Indianapolis during the American Civil War. So after the Confederate surrender of Fort Donelson in Kentucky in 1862, the Union then had 15,000 prisoners of war to deal with. So Indiana Governor Oliver Morton offered to take in about 3,000 Confederate prisoners who were ultimately brought up to Camp Morton in Indianapolis. Now, over the next year, the camp's prisoner population changed a lot due to a prisoner exchange and the arrival of other POWs. And by the end of the war, around 1,600 Confederate soldiers had died and were buried in nearby Greenlawn Cemetery. By the early 1900s, many of those graves were removed, and it became a city park, though many of those Confederate graves actually remained there in the ground. And it wasn't until 1931 when those Confederate remains were removed and reinterred here at Crown Hill Cemetery. And here today they have this interpretive sign, a stone monument marking the Confederate mound, and these bronze placards that actually lists all of the known names of Confederate POWs that died while in camp here in Indianapolis. And these are, for the most part, broken up by state. We have the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. Georgia finishes up at the top of this one. It actually also mentions two men that served from the Indian Territory as Confederates, one in the 2nd Choctaw and the other in the 2nd Cherokee. A lot from Kentucky. Of course, these men, or at least perhaps some of them, if they weren't part of the prisoner exchange, which I believe all of them were, may have been captured at Fort Donelson. If not, they were just captured at various other engagements during the American Civil War, and again died here at Camp Morton while prisoners of war during the Civil War. It's interesting. It looks like somebody put an American Legion challenge coin there here. The Mississippi Confederates. So here at Crown Hill Cemetery, there are actually 3 United States vice presidents buried, which I think most of us, by studying history, most people don't know who the vice president was for most administrations, unless it had a big piece of history. But this is the first one. This is Thomas R. Marshall, and he served as the 28th vice president of the United States and served 2 full terms under President Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1921. Here is a grave of another U.S. vice president who is buried here. This is the final resting place of Charles Warren Fairbanks, who served as the vice president under Teddy Roosevelt for just 1 term from 1905 to 1909. And he also served in the U.S. Senate for a time. And what I also just learned is that his wife, Cornelia, served as the President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution from 1901 to 1905, which is really neat. And it's a nice stone monument here. Not as big as we saw with Thomas Marshall, but it just goes to show, again, that U.S. vice presidents really fall to the wayside when you're studying American history for one reason or another. And it always makes me think of John Adams, who was the first U.S. vice president under George Washington. And he had a couple quotes here that I had to pull up that always made me sort of chuckle. He once said, quote, "I am vice president. In this I am nothing, but I may be everything," which is... I think that's outstanding. And another quote he said, quote, "My country has in its infinite wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Which actually might be pretty accurate in some senses, and I'm sure a lot of these men who served as vice president over the years may feel similar. But there you go, the final resting place of Teddy Roosevelt's vice president, or at least one of them, Charles Warren Fairbanks. Now, the 3rd U.S. vice president who's buried here at Crown Hill is right across the street and just past the Gothic chapel here from Fairbanks. And that is Vice President Thomas Andrew Hendricks, who served as the 21st vice president under President Grover Cleveland. And what is interesting about Hendricks is he actually only served as vice president for about 8 months, and he died in office in November of 1885. And he is laid to rest here at Crown Hill Cemetery. And he has a more traditional obelisk monument here, buried with other members of the Hendricks family. And not far from those other 2 vice presidents is the final resting place of Oliver P. Morton, 1823 to 1877. And Oliver Morton was Indiana's wartime governor during the American Civil War. And we've actually discussed him in some previous videos, and we actually just talked about him earlier. He's the one who volunteered Indianapolis to take in some of those Confederate prisoners of war. But he was a little bit of a bull, but he got a lot done for the state of Indiana and died on November 1st, 1877. And here his marker reads, "His country's good, with the respect more tender, more holy and profound than his own life. And this is neat, actually seeing a stone bust of Governor Morton here on top. You don't see that too often. So one cool thing about Crown Hill is sections 9 and 10 here is actually a national cemetery. And in 1866, they authorized Indianapolis to have its own national cemetery. So of course you see a lot of those well-known white headstones for veterans who are laid to rest here. That one, I think the MUSN musician probably. That's pretty neat. Yeah, I think a lot of these might be a little bit older. You got USCT back there again, U.S. Colored Troops, Kansas. Kind of a mix. I think most of these are probably from the Civil War in that era, and then some of the newer ones are over here. Yeah, so we're just walking through the National Cemetery portion to come check out some of these signs by the flag. And we just saw it a little bit ago, but Oliver P. Morton's gravesite's over there with the bust on top of it, just beyond the trees. So here at the base of the flagpole, can't really see it with the sun right behind it, but it's actually Lincoln's Gettysburg address that he gave the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery, November 19th, 1863. So we got an upturned cannon. Usually, if you've been to battlefields, especially Civil War battlefields, you've seen these as markers to mark where perhaps like a general was killed in battle. So very appropriate to see it like this here at Crown Hill. Here we see a sign just discussing the act to establish and protect national cemeteries from 1867. And as mentioned, they were authorized here in Indianapolis to have a national cemetery in 1866. But I just saw here on the side of the cannon, I don't know if it's going to come out on camera, but it's marked 1837. That's cool. Citizens of Indianapolis celebrated when the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia fell on April 3rd, 1865, and when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered on April 9th. Despair replaced joy when Lincoln was assassinated 6 days later. The president's body lay in state for 18 hours at the Indianapolis Capitol building on April 30th. And that would have been, I guess, during his train back to his home state of Illinois. Of course, he lived as a boy here in Indiana for a time. Oh, this is kind of cool. I just saw this picture. The Women's Relief Corps Monument. They erected a monument here November 1888. Well, I guess they got permission to erect a monument in November of 88. It was dedicated on Memorial Day 1889. And you can't really see it probably on camera, but it's right over there next to that other cannon. So that would be the original monument from 1889. And that is absolutely beautiful, that eagle on top, that stonework. Sitting on top a pile of cannons. Absolutely beautiful. And speaking of cannons, here we see another cannon. This one also marked 1837 with this bronze placard, absolutely beautiful placard, that reads, United States National Military Cemetery, Crown Hill, established 1866, interments 708, known 672, unknown 36. I will say one thing that's really cool about this cemetery are the different types of headstones, monuments, statues, benches. Like they seem to have a little bit more autonomy in what you can design and what you can put in place, which is cool. And here you go. Here's the final resting place of Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling, who was the inventor of the famous Gatling gun, essentially the first machine gun during the American Civil War era. some details here on this placard. Born in North Carolina, September 12, 1818, died in New York City in February of 1903. The highest honors that the world can boast are subjects far too low for my desire. The brightest beams of glory are at most incomplete compared to my belief in the immortality of the soul. I'm going to have to do a little more research. I'm not sure. Born in North Carolina, died in New York City, why he's buried here in Indianapolis. So I'll have to do a little more research on that. But a really interesting memorial and marker here at Crown Hill. And perhaps interesting, I don't know if intentional, but like I said, he's buried right across the street from the National Cemetery of men who may have utilized at one time a Gatling gun, or perhaps, hopefully not, but may have met their fate at the end of a Gatling gun. And actually, behind his monument are the grave markers themselves. So here we see Dr. R.J. Gatling, 1818 to 1903, and a few others from his family. Generally, the cemetery is in excellent shape, but some of these older sections, we do see some that have been either knocked down by the weather, I would hope. Hopefully it's not vandalism. And just some others that have kind of shifted and been misplaced over the years. So hopefully either the cemetery or family members or an organization is able to come and repair these. Because it would be a shame to lose these to time. Because then you start to lose some of the history of the people that are laid to rest here and their contributions to this world. Another one back here behind Gatling that just caught my eye, Samuel W. Drew. And it caught my eye because I saw 1798. He was born in Dover, New Hampshire, February 10th, 1798. And it looks like he died in August of 1894. If that's accurate, he was over 96 years old, which for that time period was pretty remarkable. I did not know that there was anybody buried here at Crown Hill that was born in the 1700s, and I'd imagine he's probably not the only one, though I don't know if there are many more. This white marker is for a young boy named Edward Black, who served as a drummer in the 21st Indiana Volunteers. And as you can tell, he was born on May 30th, 1853, which made him an extremely young man, or a boy, as I said, and he served in the American Civil War. In fact, he is believed to be the youngest person to have served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and also believed to likely be the youngest person to ever serve in the United States Army in its history. And sadly, he died on June 30th, 1871, so he did not live a very long life. But records that I've seen show that he enlisted on July 24th, 1861 as a musician in Company L of the 21st Indiana, and he was discharged on August 16th, 1862. So there is the grave of Edward Black. I have seen his name listed as William Black before as well, so I think maybe some census records got mixed up, or maybe his name, maybe William was his middle name perhaps. But there you have it, the grave of young Edward Black, who served in the American Civil War. And some of these other older grave markers are family members of him. So really neat to pay my respects here to a young man who served his country. All right, just down this path here is the final resting place of America's 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. And I've actually visited this gravesite before and did a full-length video on that visit and his history, so feel free to check that out if you'd like. But it's a pretty simple monument for a man who was the only Hoosier president, though he was born in North Bend, Ohio. He always considered Indiana home, and still has a house standing on the north side of Indianapolis that you can visit, and of course is laid to rest here. He died on March 13th, 1901. He did serve in the American Civil War, served as a U.S. Senator, and of course president from 1889 to 1893, just the one term. And here is the actual grave for President Benjamin Harrison. To his left is his first wife, Mary Lord Harrison. And to his right is Carolyn Scott Harrison, his second wife, who was a founding member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And one of my goals is to visit the final resting place of all the U.S. presidents. And it's always cool to come back to my native Indiana and pay tribute to Benjamin Harrison. And I've always found his gravesite, it's very simple, but it is in such a beautiful location, in such a beautiful cemetery, especially here in the fall, just covered by these beautiful yellow and red trees. It's a peaceful spot for sure. So if you ever get a chance to come to Crown Hill, I know we're visiting quite a few graves, but you got to check out the final resting place of President Benjamin Harrison. So the last grave we're going to see while we're here, because otherwise we could literally spend probably months looking at these grave sites, is at the very top or at the highest point here of Crown Hill. And what's interesting is historically this was known as Strawberry Hill, and it is one of the highest points overlooking Indianapolis, which you can actually see the skyline there in the distance. But they renamed it Crown Hill because here at the highest point, which was the crown, they just named it Crown Hill, which I think is kind of neat. And it is an amazing view. I'm sure even in the winter when all these trees are bare, it's even better. But here at the very top of Crown Hill, the very highest point of the cemetery, is buried a man named James Whitcomb Riley, who is known as the Hoosier poet. Now, James Whitcomb Riley was an American writer, poet, and a best-selling author, and he wrote a lot of children's books and poems. And perhaps one of his most famous is that of Little Orphaned Annie. And I had to read that a few times. It was historically known as Little Orphaned Annie, of course, which was adapted into the more famous movie and story known as Little Orphan Annie. But Mr. James Whitcomb Riley, who died, I believe, in 1916, has this place of honor at the highest point of Crown Hill Cemetery. Another thing I really love about this memorial is this statue of this young child reading one of his books. I don't know, I think this is a very fitting end to our time exploring Crown Hill Cemetery. It's nice being up here at the top of Crown Hill at James Whitcomb Riley's final resting place. And it was neat. I don't know. You know a lot about Indy, Dad. I'm sure you probably learned some stuff today too. So it was very enjoyable. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and head out.
For sure.
What's that?
We're all good.
That's true. That has been confirmed. But we're going to go enjoy some of this fall weather while we have it. So that's going to be it for this one. Now it's on to the next journey.